Hi there and welcome back to my channel. This is Sean, the Honest Book Reviewer, with another book review. In this video we're discussing No Child of Mine, written by Nichelle Giraldes. It's a Gothic horror. Well, it's meant to be, because it didn't give off a strong Gothic horror vibe. It didn't really give off a strong horror vibe at all to me, really. It seems mainly focused with the main character Essie's pregnancy. And all the doctor's checkups and appointments, all of those things that happen in the book, and it happens many times in the story. Also, her morning sickness happens many times in the story, as described so often, and it repeats all through the book. That didn't interest me, especially because it added nothing to the horror vibe. So if you're going to have things in a Gothic horror, make sure they add to the horror vibe. Make sure they add something of interest to the characters even, because all those things in this story didn't do that. So I found a lot of this book of no interest to me at all. This book starts off with protagonist Essie and her husband Sanjay moving into their new home. They bought an old home, a fixer-upper, and the first chapter basically is them moving into the home for the first time and walking around having a look at rooms and discussing things about the house. So not very gripping as first chapters go in a Gothic horror. It didn't grab me at all, the first chapter. I found it a bit tedious, to be honest, and I think this book would have been best served with something more exciting, more engaging as a first chapter. The other thing for Essie is she finds out she's pregnant, and that happens early on in the story. She's not sure what to do, because she's quite career driven. She wants to finish her studies and then maybe think about having a family. So she discusses it with Sanjay, her husband, and Sanjay basically gives her the option. You decide what to do. I'll support you no matter what. She decides they're going to start a family, and they set about that. They're both excited. At this stage in the story, Essie is very excited to start a family. She decides she really wants a baby. But as the story progresses, she becomes resentful for being pregnant and very angry, and it's very powerful in the story, but it feels a little bit forced, and it just makes me think about the character, how it's structured, because she decided early on how excited she was to have a child, and now she's so resentful in the story. I just didn't feel like the character was being consistent in the story. It just felt strange to me. I don't know if women go through feelings like this when they're pregnant. I'm not sure at all about that, but it just felt strange to me that this character would have those strong feelings about being so resentful when she decided to start the family with her husband, and she was so excited to have this baby in the first place. So Essie tells her own mother and her grandmother that she's pregnant as well, and her grandmother has this story about a family curse, and that's one of the concepts, the key concepts in this story. And this family curse is basically that when the women in their family have their first child, the husband dies soon after, or during the pregnancy even. And that's happened for generations apparently, and it's a known family curse to them. Essie just thinks it's superstition. She thinks it's nonsense, and she doesn't want to hear about it. But that idea does play along in this story. So there are definite attempts to bring some sort of horror or Gothic horror element into this story. Sometimes I don't think it adds a Gothic horror element. Sometimes it's more a possessed house element or a possession of a person element, not a Gothic horror element. But the things that are in this story that try to do this are, creaks and thumps and noises in the house. And then there's doors creaking open, slightly ajar, and nobody there. That sort of thing in the story. But that would have been better served in the story if Essie's reactions, because it's Essie's point of view in this story, if her reactions were stronger. When things like that happen in a house, you're not sure what they are, Essie just shrugs it off and forgets about it. That's what it feels like in the story. But to drive that horror element, to make it stronger, to build suspense, tension, to engage the reader and hook them into those scenes, Essie's reactions need to be stronger, and they're not in this story. Essie also has dreams about this long corridor with all these doors branching off, and then this shadow that's almost like smoke in a way, that's coming and trying to envelop her or touch her, and she hears a woman calling her name. And As the story progresses, this dream repeats, and it gets longer and longer, or she advances further into the dream at certain times as well. And I didn't find that repetitive nature of the dream very engaging. It felt very tedious. So every time it happened, I was like, oh, just not again. This dream's happening again, and I'm going to have the same kind of corridor, and I'm going to see the same smoke, this same dark kind of smoke, or dark cloud, whatever it is that's trying to envelop Essie. Essie's going to have the same voice calling out sometimes. It's going to have all these things repeat every time she has the dream. And I found it very tedious, and it went nowhere fast. Would have been better served to have that dream happen less often, and maybe just bring something about that dream into the story early on to ramp up that tension and suspense, because it just felt like it was going nowhere for so long in the story, and it almost felt like that Essie had the dream, woke up and screamed sometimes. Okay, so she did wake up and scream sometimes, but then she seemed to forget about the dream. So it just didn't have that impact in the story for me. What this story needed was another point of view. Essie's point of view wasn't driving the slow burn psychological tension enough in this story. I think having Sanjay's point of view would have aided that, because a lot of changes happen for Sanjay. We see them happening in the story. We see them very lightly, I think. There's not a strong description of them, but we see enough to know his personality is changing, his behaviour is changing. It should have been stronger with Essie's point of view, but if not strong enough through her point of view, then bring Sanjay's point of view into the story. This story also has a past narrative, and much of the past narrative is based on letters between two friends, Anna and Isabel. Now, parts of this past narrative are okay, but it's more towards the end of the book. Everything else leading up to that is just distracting and annoying. That's my view anyway. I usually don't like authors using letters and journal entries to drive a narrative in a story, and this is a perfect example of that happening. It just interrupts the flow of the present day narrative too often, and I just found those letters between Isabel and Anna, while they add a little bit of colour maybe into the characters of those two characters, I just found that it just was too distracting because it happened too often. Would have been better if the past narrative was condensed more, and maybe bigger chunks of it. I can't believe I'm saying that, but maybe bigger chunks of the past narrative, but something to make it seem worthwhile, because until towards the end of the story, where it's a bit meatier, where we've got things happening in that past narrative, it just felt a bit pointless to me, and it just felt like those characters were adding nothing to the overall story. Look, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think this is one of those times where this story needed something big at the start, something maybe that was from the conclusion of a past or present narrative, but something big at the start to grip the reader and engage them, because it didn't really engage me at the very start of this story. And usually I don't like when books bring something forward to the beginning of the story that happens later on in the story. I don't like that as a rule, but I think this book needed something like that, because it just doesn't grip the reader into that first part of the story. It takes a long time to have something in there to engage the reader, and I felt a very tedious process, a long process, until I was fully engaged in this story, and I don't even know if I was fully engaged by the end, but at least I was more engaged towards the end of the story than I was for most of the start of the story. So Essie, our protagonist. I'm not sure if the reader's meant to dislike Essie in this story, but there are many moments in the story where she's easy to dislike. Her resentment and anger just comes through so forceful. It feels too forced to me in the story. It makes me wonder why it's there actually, because it makes the character feel not consistent. It's just irregular in the story for me, when the character's just so happy and so joyful at the start of the story, and then this anger, resentment happens, is because of the house, something driving that because of the house. We're never told that. It just seems it's coming from her, and just makes the reader dislike her. That's my view anyway. And just overall as a character, she's inconsistent. She just feels not complete as a character. Sometimes she feels one-dimensional, sometimes she feels like she's getting more facets to her, but there's something about her that feels incomplete and rushed as a character. I like Sanjay in the story, despite the fact that for many moments in this book he feels one-dimensional, and he does. He feels like his character's there just to be agreeable all the time, to be this saint character in the story. That's what he feels like, that's his purpose in the book. But those changes in Sanjay through Essie's point of view, even though they're not described strongly, they're different. They make him seem different in the story, and they don't feel that forced. They feel more organic. They're a bit clumsily written, I admit, but they just feel different to the story. So it makes him feel a bit more real than Essie in the book. That's my point of view anyway. Anna and Isabel, I'll describe them together in this video because for me, they felt like the same character but with two different names. I couldn't differentiate their characters in the story. And for most of the book, they just felt like their characters made no impact to the story really. Towards the end of the book, that changes when certain things happen. But I just think they needed to be stronger in the story early on. So, as characters go, not totally disappointing, but disappointing for much of the story. I really wanted to like this book more than I did, because I do like Gothic horror, but this book wasn't very strong in Gothic horror. It wasn't really strong in horror elements at all, really. I rate this a 2 out of 5. There's so many things to like about the concept of this story. The concept was intriguing and interesting, and that's the reason why I wanted to read this book, because it just sounded interesting and engaging from the blurb. But it's one of those books where the blurb promised a lot, but the execution didn't deliver. So overall, not a great story. There are things there that are done well, but many things that aren't done that well in my point of view. On my channel, I review many horror books. If you enjoy horror, check out my channel and subscribe. On the screen now is a link to a video for another book I'm sure you'll enjoy.